Welcome, travellers of time and dream. Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in, dim the lights, slow your breath, and let your imagination drift to another world. But first, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Drop a comment below your city, your country, or maybe even your cozy little corner of the world. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey through history's quiet wonders. Now, close your eyes. The night deepens, and across the waters of an ancient lake, the city of Tenochtitlan begins to stir. The sprawling city of Tenochtitlan, situated on the vast lake system of the Valley of Mexico, was a marvel in its time, though its wonders are often overshadowed by the dramatic tales of conquest and empire. As you imagine it, try to picture not only the grand temples and the bustling market squares, but the quieter lifelines of daily sustenance, the chinampas, or floating gardens. These were not floating in the whimsical sense you might imagine, drifting freely on the water, but rather carefully constructed rectangular plots of fertile soil, anchored in place by wooden stakes, reeds, and the roots of aquatic plants. The origins of chinampas date back centuries before the rise of the Aztec Empire, but by the 15th century, they had become the backbone of Tenochtitlan's food supply. The Aztecs faced a peculiar challenge. Their city was essentially an island network, surrounded by the shallow, brackish waters of Lake Texcoco. Natural farmland was limited, and the local soil often suffered from salinity that made traditional agriculture unreliable. The genius of chinampa construction lay in its simplicity and sustainability. Layers of mud dredged from the lake bottom were piled on woven mats of reeds, overlaid with aquatic vegetation. These plots, meticulously maintained, allowed for year-round cultivation without the need for fallow periods. Life on the chinampas was, for the most part, quiet, repetitive, and labor-intensive. Farmers, or chinamperos, began work at dawn, moving along narrow wooden walkways that connected each garden plot. Water was both a friend and a constant challenge. The lake provided irrigation and nutrients, but also required careful management to prevent erosion or flooding. Crops were rotated and interplanted with a precision that might seem tedious to modern eyes. Corn, beans, squash, amaranth, chilies, and flowers were cultivated together, taking advantage of natural symbiosis. Beans, for instance, would climb the corn stalks, while their nitrogen-fixing roots enriched the soil. Chinampa maintenance was not a seasonal task but a continuous process. Each layer of mud, each bundle of reeds, each new planting had to be carefully managed. Farmers collected aquatic weeds daily, either to reinforce the edges of the plots or to compost back into the soil. Fish and other small aquatic creatures in the surrounding water provided additional nutrients, and in some cases were raised intentionally alongside the crops. The labor was physically demanding, repetitive, and often monotonous, but it was effective, reliable, and crucial for feeding tens of thousands of people. Beyond the physical labor, the social life of the chinamperos was marked by routine observation and meticulous record-keeping. Each family might be responsible for several plots, and their productivity was closely tied to communal expectations and local regulations. The Aztec state had systems to monitor land use, distribution of water, and crop yields. Tax records often required the reporting of not just the produce, but the number of work hours devoted to cultivation. While the central temples and markets drew attention for their ceremonial and economic significance, the quiet labor on the chinampas sustained the entire urban population. Walking along these narrow, reed-lined causeways, a farmer would notice the subtle changes in water level and soil texture, the encroachment of algae, or the signs of pests. Each of these details, though mundane, determined whether a family would eat well in the coming months. Work on the chinampas required patience, attentiveness, and an intimate understanding of the interplay between land, water, and human labor. The monotony of daily observation, the repetition of planting, weeding, and harvesting, contributed to a rhythm of life that was both predictable and essential. Despite their humble appearance, chinampas represented a profound understanding of ecological balance. The Aztecs had essentially engineered a wetland farming system that could thrive for decades without depleting the surrounding ecosystem. Modern research shows that the soil composition in these floating gardens was remarkably nutrient-rich, capable of supporting multiple crop cycles per year. The repetition of planting and harvesting, the careful layering of organic matter, and the slow, almost imperceptible improvements in soil fertility were all part of a system that exemplified human ingenuity applied to survival in a challenging environment. This quiet mastery extended beyond agriculture. The edges of chinampas were used for canals that facilitated canoe transportation, linking the floating fields to the broader market network of Tenochtitlan. Goods could be moved efficiently without the need for roads, reducing labor and maximizing efficiency. The canals themselves required maintenance, dredging, clearing reeds, and preventing stagnation, but they formed a subtle, invisible network that kept the city fed and connected. As you imagine the Chinamperos at work, moving rhythmically through the water-bound plots, consider the immense patience and diligence required. Each day followed patterns nearly identical to the one before, yet each decision, how much mud to add, which crops to plant in which combination, how to repair the edges after a storm carried consequences for survival. The floating gardens, in all their quiet persistence, supported a population and a civilization that, to outsiders, might have seemed entirely dependent on temples, warriors, and markets, but in reality relied on these hidden, labor-intensive systems. Even today, we can recognize the subtle genius in these gardens. Modern engineers study chinampas to understand sustainable agriculture, water management, and ecological balance. The Aztecs, through repetitive, careful, and deliberate effort, had created an enduring system that transformed a challenging environment into a productive, resilient landscape. Yet one question lingers. How did the people themselves perceive this constant labor? Did they feel pride, obligation, or monotony as they tended plots that were, for all intents and purposes, invisible to most city dwellers, despite their vital importance? Perhaps the most compelling mystery of the Chinampas is not in the architecture or agricultural science, but in the quiet rhythm of human life they represent. Centuries of observation and toil, largely unnoticed by outsiders, formed the backbone of one of history's most remarkable cities. And as the waters of Lake Texcoco swirled gently around the planted plots, one cannot help but wonder how many other civilizations have quietly depended on such hidden systems, their achievements invisible to the annals of history. The story of the Chinampas, in its first part, leaves us with an enduring image, a vast city floating upon the lake, not only supported by stone and timber, but by mud, reeds, and the slow, almost meditative labor of countless farmers. And yet, the larger context of these gardens, the social, political, and environmental forces that shaped their construction, maintenance, and eventual decline, remains to be explored. What challenges lay ahead for the Chinampas as the Aztec Empire expanded, faced enemies, and encountered changes in climate, water levels, and political control? The answers, like the canals of Tenochtitlan themselves, are hidden just beneath the surface. As the sun rose over the calm waters of Lake Texcoco, the Chinamperos, farmers of the floating gardens, moved along the narrow wooden walkways with practiced precision. What appeared to outsiders as a simple agricultural task was in reality the convergence of ecology, society, and statecraft. These floating plots were not merely private gardens for families, they were a lifeline for the bustling metropolis of Tenochtitlan, a city whose population numbered in the hundreds of thousands by the early 16th century. Life on the Chinampas was regimented, not only by the cycles of planting and harvesting, but also by social obligations. Each Chinampero was a member of a Calpulli, a local community unit that managed land distribution, labor, and taxation. Land was not privately owned in the modern sense. Instead, families held rights to cultivate specific plots in perpetuity, but they were responsible to the Calpulli for productivity and contribution. This communal oversight ensured that the city's food supply remained reliable, but it also imposed subtle pressures. The work was repetitive, the oversight constant, and the expectation of compliance unyielding. One of the most striking features of Chinampa life was its integration with the surrounding aquatic environment. Farmers had to observe and adapt to subtle changes in water levels caused by rainfall, seasonal evaporation, and the distant mountains feeding the lake. Too much water, and the edges of the Chinampas would erode too little, and crops risked wilting. The Aztecs had developed an intricate understanding of hydrology, reinforced over generations. Wooden stakes and reed bundles anchored the plots, preventing drift, while canals were carefully dredged to maintain circulation and prevent stagnation. The labor required was unglamorous but critical, often taking the form of hours spent hauling mud, weaving reeds, or repairing walkways. Beyond the labor itself, the political and social dimensions of the Chinampas were profound. The Aztec rulers recognized that a secure food supply underpinned both military power and civic stability. Tribute and taxation systems often relied on surplus crops produced by Chinampa farmers, funneled through marketplaces like Tlatelolco, one of the largest in the region. Market inspectors, bureaucrats, and messengers constantly moved among the canals, recording quantities, ensuring compliance, and mediating disputes. In a sense, Each Chinampa was simultaneously a site of production and an instrument of governance, quietly reinforcing the authority of the state. The cultivation of Chinampas also reflected a broader ecological intelligence. By alternating crops and using interplanting strategies, the farmers maintained soil fertility without chemical inputs. Corn, beans, squash, and amaranth formed a complementary system. Beans replenished nitrogen, corn provided structural support, and squash offered ground cover that reduced erosion. Flowers and medicinal plants were also interspersed, serving both practical and ceremonial purposes. This careful planning, repeated year after year, transformed the floating gardens into living ecosystems, demonstrating a quiet but profound mastery over nature. Yet, despite this sophisticated management, challenges persisted. The lake itself was unpredictable. Periodic flooding could wash away newly planted seeds, while droughts threatened the most carefully tended plots. Seasonal winds stirred the water, threatening the fragile walkways connecting the plots. Farmers had to constantly monitor their environment, reacting to subtle changes that could mean the difference between abundance and scarcity. Beyond environmental factors, social disruptions, conflict between Kalpulli, shifts in political power, or demands for increased tribute added another layer of complexity to their lives. Water management was a daily concern. Farmers used small canals to irrigate individual plots, carefully regulating flow to avoid erosion. They dredged mud from the lake bottom to reinforce their fields and maintain fertility. This sediment, rich in nutrients, was a critical resource, yet gathering it required physically demanding work. Hours were spent moving heavy clumps of soil, shaping them into layers on top of the woven mats of reeds. The repetitive nature of this labor created a rhythm of life that was both meditative and exhausting, a pattern repeated across thousands of plots in the vast network of Chinampas. The societal structures surrounding Chinampa cultivation further influenced daily life. Responsibilities were often divided along gender lines, with women tending to smaller plots, processing seeds, and handling domestic tasks linked to food production, while men focused on constructing and maintaining the main plots and canals. Children were gradually introduced to the work, learning observation, patience, and careful attention to detail from an early age. Life on the Chinampas was not leisurely. It demanded a disciplined approach to labor, observation, and coordination with neighbors. Economic factors also shaped the rhythm of the Chinampas. The marketplace at Tlatelolco was the hub for the sale and redistribution of produce, and prices were influenced not only by yield, but by social and political pressures. Farmers needed to balance subsistence with trade, ensuring that their families were fed while contributing surplus crops for taxes, religious offerings, and urban consumption. This dual role, producer for household and contributor to the state, required careful planning, as any miscalculation could disrupt both family life and broader societal needs. Chinampa agriculture, despite its efficiency and ecological intelligence, faced a looming, less visible challenge: urban expansion and political pressures. Tenochtitlan grew rapidly, and as the city expanded, space for cultivation became more contested. Canals were rerouted, plots were reassigned, and some traditional patterns of land management were disrupted. Furthermore, the growing demand for tribute and the pressures of supporting a complex urban population placed increasing stress on both the farmers and the ecosystem itself. These pressures were largely invisible to the city's elite, who focused on grand architecture, ceremonial life, and political maneuvering, while the laborers of the Chinampas quietly sustained the entire social structure. Environmental knowledge alone was insufficient. Farmers had to navigate shifting political realities, balancing obligations to local authorities and city rulers. Disputes over water rights or plot boundaries could escalate, requiring intervention from Kalpulli elders or market officials. While these incidents were far from dramatic in the context of battle or conquest, they were crucial for maintaining order and sustaining productivity. The delicate interplay of labor, law, and local ecology created a system that was stable yet perpetually at risk from small disruptions. It is worth noting that the success of the Chinampas was not immediately apparent to an observer unfamiliar with the city. From a distance, the plots might appear as nothing more than muddy rectangles floating on the water, yet they represented centuries of accumulated knowledge, social coordination, and human endurance. The quiet labor of hundreds, perhaps thousands, of families sustained the Aztec capital, making possible not only its ceremonial splendor, but its very survival. And yet, as sophisticated as this system was, it carried inherent fragilities. Natural disasters, such as storms or unusual droughts, could disrupt the carefully balanced ecology. Social unrest, political upheaval, or external invasion could further compromise productivity. Even small miscalculations in water management or crop rotation could ripple outward, affecting not only individual families but the entire urban population. The floating gardens, while resilient, were not invincible. They were a testament to human ingenuity and persistence, but also to the precariousness of life in a city built on water. As the second section of our exploration of the Chinampas concludes, a question remains. How would these carefully managed gardens fare under the extraordinary pressures of external conquest and colonization? When unfamiliar forces arrived with new technologies, diseases, and political systems, what would become of this delicate balance between labor, ecology, and society? The answer, buried in the next chapter of history, is both illuminating and quietly unsettling, revealing not only the ingenuity of the Aztecs, but also the fragility of human systems in the face of unforeseen disruption. The story of the Chinampas reaches a turning point as the Aztec Empire confronted forces that would reshape its entire world. By the early 16th century, Tenochtitlan stood as a symbol of architectural brilliance, political organization, and economic complexity. Yet beneath its towering temples and bustling marketplaces, the floating gardens continued their quiet, steady work. They were the city's lifeblood, feeding tens of thousands, supplying the markets, and sustaining the tribute system that reinforced the empire's power. But the arrival of foreign invaders would test the resilience of this carefully engineered ecosystem in ways the Aztecs could scarcely have imagined. When Hernán Cortés and his contingent of Spanish forces arrived in 1519, they brought not only soldiers and horses, but an invisible, devastating companion. Disease, smallpox, and other European illnesses spread through the population with terrifying efficiency. While the Spanish conquest narrative often focuses on battles, alliances, and dramatic captures, the quieter story of daily survival is just as important. Entire neighborhoods were depopulated, and the workforce responsible for tending the Chinampas diminished drastically. Fields that had once yielded abundant crops now faced neglect, erosion, and encroaching weeds. The balance that had taken centuries to achieve was unraveling under the dual pressures of disease and conquest. Even before the Spanish arrived, the sustainability of the Chinampa system had relied heavily on the uninterrupted cooperation of Calpulli communities and the careful management of water and soil. With social structures disrupted, canals became clogged, plots fell into disrepair, and centuries of accumulated ecological knowledge risked being lost. The Aztec capital, so reliant on its agricultural backbone, began to experience food shortages. Markets once teeming with the colors and aromas of fresh produce became less reliable, and families faced the harsh reality that the lifeways of their ancestors were no longer sufficient to guarantee survival. Yet, despite these pressures, the Chinampas did not vanish entirely. In the decades following the conquest, some plots were maintained under Spanish oversight. The Spanish recognized their value as food sources, though often they restructured land ownership and introduced new crops, such as wheat and sugarcane, altering traditional practices. The combination of new governance, new crops, and the continuing threat of environmental variability created a transformed agricultural landscape. What had once been an intricate, self-sustaining ecosystem became partially subordinated to colonial economic priorities. The quiet genius of the Aztec system persisted in fragments, hidden beneath layers of foreign-imposed structures and disrupted routines. Interestingly, the resilience of the Chinampas lies not only in their physical design, but in their conceptual flexibility. Farmers adapted, using old techniques alongside new crops and methods. In some cases, plots that had been neglected were revived, demonstrating the enduring practicality of the system. Modern studies of surviving Chinampa plots in Xochimilco, south of Mexico City, show that centuries-old agricultural principles, intercropping, water management, and soil layering continue to sustain small-scale cultivation even in the contemporary world. The same techniques that quietly fed one of the largest cities of pre-Columbian America still hold relevance today. The story of the Chinampas teaches an important lesson about human ingenuity and fragility. They were a triumph of ecological understanding and social coordination, demonstrating how ordinary labor, repeated day after day, could sustain extraordinary urban civilization. Yet their eventual decline under the combined pressures of foreign conquest, disease, and political disruption reminds us that even the most effective human systems are vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The Aztecs had mastered their environment in ways that were largely invisible to the outside world, yet that mastery alone was insufficient to protect them from unforeseen historical events. Perhaps what is most remarkable is the quiet dignity of this labor. Chinampa farmers did not build monuments or write epic histories. Their work was repetitive, physically demanding, and largely invisible. Yet without it, the grand temples, marketplaces, and political institutions of Tenochtitlan could not have existed. In a sense, the floating gardens are a reminder that the foundations of civilization are often modest, hidden, and overlooked. Civilization does not rise on monuments alone, it rises on mud, reeds, careful observation, and the patient hands of ordinary people. Even now, as you consider the quiet canals and layered plots, a question remains: How might modern societies benefit from this patient, sustainable approach to agriculture? The challenges of climate change, urbanization, and ecological degradation echo the trials faced by Chinampa farmers centuries ago. Could the slow, deliberate practices of the past offer solutions for the future? The floating gardens of Tenochtitlan, in the end, are more than a historical curiosity. They are a testament to human resilience, ingenuity, and the often overlooked labor that sustains life. They remind us that history is not only shaped by conquests and kings, but by the quiet, persistent work of countless individuals tending fields on water, observing, adjusting, and repeating tasks that may seem monotonous, yet are vital for survival. And as the waters of Lake Texcoco once carried the weight of a great civilization, the memory of those gardens continues to flow through history, a subtle but enduring current of human perseverance. The Chinampas are a symbol of how ordinary labor underpins extraordinary achievement. While grand architecture and political power capture attention, it is the patient, repetitive work, the accumulation of small, almost invisible actions, that often sustains society. In studying these gardens, we gain insight not only into Aztec civilization, but into the principles of resilience, sustainability, and human cooperation that remain relevant across centuries. When you imagine the Roman Empire, your mind might immediately picture grand amphitheaters, monumental aqueducts, or the bustling forum. But beneath this grandeur lay a network of quiet, persistent labor that was essential to the empire's survival. The roads. Stretching over hundreds of thousands of miles, Roman roads were more than stone and mortar, they were the arteries of an empire, carrying soldiers, officials, merchants, and messengers across vast and often inhospitable landscapes. And the men and women who built these roads, specialized laborers, soldiers, and local workers, led lives of extraordinary routine, discipline, and endurance. The construction of a Roman road was neither fast nor glamorous. While legends often credit engineers with swift, brilliant execution, the reality was painstakingly slow. Roads were designed with remarkable precision, but the act of constructing them required weeks, months, or even years of repetitive labor. Workers began by surveying the land, marking straight lines where possible, and identifying obstacles. Hills, rivers, and marshes presented challenges that required careful planning. Surveying instruments were simple, measuring rods, ropes, and Gromer's wooden sighting tools, yet their use demanded meticulous attention. Every deviation could result in a weak foundation, uneven surface, or a road that failed under the weight of traffic. Once the path was marked, excavation began. Workers removed topsoil, dug ditches, and leveled surfaces, often using picks, shovels, and baskets to move earth. Stones were quarried nearby or transported from distant sites, sorted by size and shaped into layers. This layering process was methodical. Large foundation stones formed the base, followed by smaller stones, gravel, and sand, then topped with carefully fitted paving stones. Each layer required compaction, alignment, and inspection. The rhythm of labor, dig, carry, stack, compact, repeat, dominated the lives of the builders, creating a slow, almost hypnotic progression across the landscape. The organization of labor itself was meticulous. Soldiers, particularly during military campaigns, often doubled as road builders, providing a disciplined workforce capable of sustained effort. Local laborers, sometimes conscripted or paid, supplemented these teams. Each group had defined responsibilities. Some dug ditches, some cut stones, and others transported materials along temporary tracks. Supervisors ensured that work proceeded according to the planned alignment and structural requirements. Despite the apparent monotony, the work demanded precision, endurance, and an understanding of materials and terrain. A poorly constructed road could collapse under the weight of carts, wagons, or marching soldiers, delaying campaigns and disrupting trade. One of the most remarkable aspects of Roman roads was their longevity. Engineers understood the importance of drainage, grading, and durability. Ditches flanking the roads carried water away, preventing erosion, while cambered surfaces allowed rain to run off. Stones were carefully selected to withstand weather and traffic, and their placement required exacting attention. Workers repeated these methods across hundreds of miles, sometimes in regions that seemed inhospitable, marshlands, rocky hills, dense forests, or deserts. The repetition and slow pace were essential, there was no room for shortcuts. Each decision, each placement of stone had long-term consequences. The monotony of road construction was punctuated only by the occasional challenges imposed by nature. Rain could turn work sites into muddy quagmires, making transport of heavy stones nearly impossible. Heat and cold tested the endurance of workers. In marshy areas, timbers had to be laid to stabilize the foundation, while rivers required the slow construction of bridges using wooden frameworks, stone abutments, and sometimes temporary pontoons. The pace was deliberate because haste threatened structural integrity. Builders had to embrace repetition, focus, and an almost meditative patience. Despite the apparent dullness of the work, Roman roads were socially and economically significant. They connected remote towns, enabled the collection of taxes, facilitated trade, and allowed the movement of troops to quell uprisings. Markets in Gaul, Hispania, and the provinces were linked through these roads, carrying everything from wine and olive oil to grain and textiles. Messages and decrees from the central government travelled along these routes, ensuring cohesion across a sprawling empire. Every day, as labourers hauled stones, compacted gravel, or aligned paving slabs, they were not merely building a road, they were laying the foundations for imperial control. Workers themselves experienced a quiet rhythm of life dictated by these tasks. Days began early, often at dawn, and were filled with repetitive motion, cutting, lifting, shaping, and placing. Meals were simple, often bread, cheese, and olives, eaten quickly between labour cycles. Nights were spent in tents, barracks, or rudimentary shelters, with exhaustion defining the end of each day. The labour was unglamorous, often unrecognised, but its importance was undeniable. Without these quiet, repetitive actions, the entire machinery of the Roman state commerce, communication, and military mobility would falter. One of the subtler challenges was maintaining morale and precision in such repetitive work. Soldiers trained for battle were suddenly engaged in slow, physically demanding construction tasks. Local labourers might resist conscription or find ways to reduce their workload. Supervisors had to enforce discipline without compromising the quality of construction. It was a delicate balance between authority, cooperation, and the monotony of physical labour. Each day brought incremental progress, a layer of stones here, a cleared ditch there, a levelled path stretching a few metres further. Progress was visible only in retrospect, but over months and years it accumulated into the vast network that became the hallmark of Roman infrastructure. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of this labour is its quiet endurance. Roads were built not for spectacle but for function. Unlike the Colosseums or temples, no one praised the alignment of stones or the precision of drainage ditches. Yet these roads persisted for centuries, outlasting the empire itself in many regions. Their durability is a testament to the repetitive, patient labour of countless individuals who likely never received recognition for their contribution. Each cobblestone was a small act of human perseverance, a quiet achievement in a civilization that self well to the methodical demands of road maintenance. For local labourers, conscription or contracted labour often dictated participation, creating a rhythm of work that persisted regardless of weather, political stability, or personal preference. Even seemingly minor environmental changes could have significant consequences. Heavy rains might wash away carefully aligned stones, sudden droughts hardened the soil, making excavation more difficult. In marshy regions, subsidence threatened road foundations, requiring the installation of timber pilings or additional stone layers. Workers had to be attuned not only to the physical state of the road, but to the subtle signs of impending failure. A poorly maintained road could become impassable, disrupting trade, military movements, or tax collection, with cascading consequences for the surrounding community. The social dimension of road building and maintenance was equally significant. Roads served as conduits for more than physical goods. They carried information, culture, and authority. Couriers transported official decrees and tax records along these routes, while soldiers moved swiftly to suppress rebellions or enforce new laws. Markets and towns relied on roads to receive essential goods, from grain to wine to tools. The labourers themselves, by ensuring the roads remained functional, became unwitting participants in the broader political machinery of the empire. Their repetitive, quiet work was foundational to governance and economic integration, yet largely invisible in historical records. One of the fascinating elements of Roman road management was the combination of standardization and local adaptation. Roads in distant provinces adhered to a recognizable structure, stone foundations, gravel beds, drainage ditches, but engineers adapted construction techniques to local conditions. In rocky regions, stones were split and laid with care to prevent shifting in marshlands. Wooden foundations stabilized soft soil. This adaptability required knowledge, observation, and repeated practice. Workers often learned through experience, applying small adjustments that accumulated over months and years, creating roads that were both uniform in principle and resilient in practice. Labourers also navigated complex human networks. Supervisors had to coordinate multiple teams, ensuring that quarry workers, stone cutters, transporters, and pavers worked in concert. Conflicts occasionally arose, disputes over workload, material quality, or scheduling could slow progress, requiring diplomacy as much as discipline. Soldiers were accustomed to hierarchical command structures, but local laborers relied on negotiation, payment, and the subtle enforcement of social norms. Maintaining cohesion across these diverse groups was essential. A breakdown in coordination could compromise both construction quality and project timelines. Economically, roads were transformative. By enabling faster, more predictable travel, they increased trade efficiency, lowered transport costs, and allowed agricultural surpluses to reach urban centers. The movement of goods stimulated local economies, from inns and taverns along the road to markets in regional hubs. But this economic benefit was intimately tied to labor. Without the slow, methodical effort of countless workers who lifted stones, dug foundations, and maintained surfaces, these economic networks would have been impossible. Civilization in this sense depended on unglamorous persistence rather than sudden innovation or monumental events. Health and endurance were constant concerns for laborers. Long hours in the sun or rain, combined with heavy physical exertion, imposed significant wear on the body. Injuries were common. Blisters, sprains, and fractures could slow work for days or weeks. Food rations were modest, typically bread, porridge, and occasionally meat or vegetables, providing enough sustenance to continue labor, but rarely comfort. Shelter at night was often temporary. Tents, wooden huts, or crowded barracks, reinforcing the sense that the road-building life was one of discipline, routine, and endurance. Yet it was this very persistence, repeated day after day, that created infrastructure lasting centuries. Interestingly, the rhythm of road construction also fostered subtle cultural integration. Soldiers and laborers carried news, practices, and habits from their home regions to distant provinces. Local workers observed Roman techniques, adopting or adapting them to local conditions. Even in remote areas, Roman roads created slow but persistent contact between communities, blending economies, languages, and customs. The monotony of labor was intertwined with a quiet form of cultural transmission, as the physical work of building and maintaining roads reinforced social cohesion across vast distances. And yet, even these carefully constructed roads had limits. Political instability, invasions, and civil wars sometimes disrupted labor, leaving stretches of road in disrepair. Natural disasters, floods, landslides, earthquakes could destroy sections of otherwise resilient infrastructure. The very factors that enabled Roman roads to integrate an empire, hierarchical labor, standardized engineering, and disciplined enforcement, were vulnerable when governance faltered or attention shifted. The success of these roads and the empire itself rested on the continuous, repetitive labor of ordinary people who worked within a system that could not survive prolonged neglect. As this section concludes, one can see the tension between labor and empire. The roads were a testament to human persistence, yet their longevity was inseparable from the political, social, and environmental context that supported them. Without attention, the stones would crumble, the ditches would fill, and the empire's arteries would fail. The question remains, what happened to these roads and to the laborers' work once the empire began to fragment and fall? How did centuries of repetition, precision, and endurance in mundane tasks? The daily work of countless laborers, repeated over years and decades, creates the material and organizational foundations that enable societies to flourish. Yet those same achievements are vulnerable to disruption when labor systems collapse or governance fails. The roads are simultaneously a triumph of human diligence and a warning about fragility. Even today, remnants of Roman roads dot the European landscape. Some are incorporated into modern highways, others lie hidden beneath fields or forests, and a few are preserved as historical artifacts. Walking along these ancient paths, one can almost sense the echoes of laborers who day after day carried stones, measured alignments, and maintained surfaces with painstaking care. Their work, repetitive and often unrecognized, continues to support modern transportation, commerce, and historical understanding. It is a quiet testament to the endurance of human effort, the invisible scaffolding of civilization, and the profound impact of ordinary labor across centuries. And yet a lingering question remains: how many other civilizations, with similar dedication to routine, repetitive labor, have built enduring infrastructure that is now lost to history? How many systems of human ingenuity quietly shape societies, only to fade when labor, governance, or social cohesion faltered? The story of Roman road builders invites reflection on the invisible labor that sustains life, civilization, and connectivity. Not only in the past but in our modern world as well, Roman roads remind us that the persistence of civilization depends on repetitive, disciplined human labor, often invisible and uncelebrated. Their longevity persisted, but in ways that highlight both the resilience and fragility of human achievement. By the 5th century CE, as political authority fractured and central oversight waned, many roads fell into partial disrepair. Stones loosened, drainage ditches silted up, and stretches of once pristine thoroughfares became difficult to traverse. Travelers and merchants, accustomed to efficient movement across provinces, now faced delays, detours, and unpredictable conditions. The grand network, so carefully constructed through centuries of labor, was suddenly vulnerable to neglect and natural decay. Yet even in decline, Roman roads continued to shape human settlement and movement. Villages, towns, and trade hubs that had grown along their routes persisted, relying on whatever sections remained usable. Travelers adapted, learning to navigate damaged stretches or improvise crossings over broken bridges. Roads that had once been carefully maintained by organized labor forces now depended on local initiative and slow, improvisational repair. In some regions, medieval communities partially restored sections, using whatever materials were available, often blending Roman engineering with local building traditions. The labor of earlier generations, soldiers, engineers, and laborers, continued to influence life centuries later, demonstrating a quiet, almost invisible endurance. The human aspect of this continuity is fascinating. While the empire that commissioned the roads had vanished, the rhythm of labor, the slow repetition of lifting, placing, and repairing stones, persisted in localized forms. Peasants, villagers, and emerging medieval authorities became custodians of the infrastructure, even without full knowledge of its original design principles. The roads were no longer part of a centralized imperial system, yet the cumulative work of countless builders centuries earlier enabled mobility, commerce, and cultural exchange. In this way, the repetition, discipline, and perseverance of Roman laborers created a ripple effect that extended long beyond their lifetimes. Archaeological evidence underscores the extraordinary durability of Roman construction. Roads like the Via Appia, sections of the Via Aurelia, and stretches of other major routes remained usable for centuries after maintenance by Roman authorities ceased. Their foundations, carefully layered with stones, gravel, and sand, continued to support travel and commerce. Some roads were integrated into medieval trade routes, while others formed the basis for modern highways. The stones themselves, placed by laborers performing repetitive, meticulous work, became a physical connection across time, linking ancient civilizations to the modern world. However, this endurance also highlights the vulnerability inherent in reliance on human systems. While the physical roads persisted, the social structures and labor systems that created and maintained them often collapsed under pressure. Political instability, economic disruption, and shifting population centers meant that the full potential of the roads could no longer be realized. The empire had invested not just in stone and gravel, but in systems of labor, organization, and enforcement. When those systems faltered, the infrastructure became more fragile, even as it continued to function partially. The story of Roman roads is thus a reminder that human achievements are often as dependent on social and political stability as on engineering skill. The laborers themselves remain largely invisible in historical records. Few names survive, and the majority of recognition is directed at engineers, officials, or military leaders. Yet the road's survival depended entirely on the countless hands that dug, lifted, placed, and compacted material over decades. Their work was repetitive, unglamorous, and physically demanding, often performed under harsh environmental conditions with minimal reward. Yet without this labor, the empire's connectivity, commerce, and military logistics would have faltered. The quiet, persistent effort of these individuals created a framework that supported one of history's most expansive civilizations. The social and economic consequences of the road's decline are also revealing. As maintenance decreased, trade slowed, markets became less reliable, and communication between regions weakened. Local authorities had to fill gaps, improvising repairs and organizing ad hoc labor forces. Communities adapted to changing conditions, sometimes reverting to older routes or creating new paths through the landscape. These adaptations illustrate human resilience. Even when formal systems fail, people find ways to maintain mobility and connection, drawing on local knowledge, repetition, and patience echoes of the labor practices that had originally created the roads. From a broader perspective, Roman roads offer lessons about the relationship between labor, infrastructure, and societal continuity. Civilization is often remembered for monumental achievements, but it is built upon repetition, precision, and endurance in mundane tasks. The daily work of countless laborers, repeated over years and decades, creates the material and organizational foundations that enable societies to flourish. Yet those same achievements are vulnerable to disruption when labor systems collapse or governance fails. The roads are simultaneously a triumph of human diligence and a warning about fragility. Even today, remnants of Roman roads dot the European landscape. Some are incorporated into modern highways, others lie hidden beneath fields or forests, and a few are preserved as historical artifacts. Walking along these ancient paths, one can almost sense the echoes of laborers who, day after day, carried stones, measured alignments, and maintained surfaces with painstaking care. Their work, repetitive and often unrecognized, continues to support modern transportation, commerce, and historical understanding. It is a quiet testament to the endurance of human effort, the invisible scaffolding of civilization, and the profound impact of ordinary labor across centuries. And yet a lingering question remains: how many other civilizations, with similar dedication to routine, repetitive labor, have built enduring infrastructure that is now lost to history? How many systems of human ingenuity quietly shaped societies, only to fade when labor, governance, or social cohesion faltered? The story of Roman road builders invites reflection on the invisible labor that sustains life, civilization, and connectivity, not only in the past but in our modern world as well. Roman roads remind us that the persistence of civilization depends on repetitive, disciplined human labor, often invisible and uncelebrated. Their longevity demonstrates both the power of cumulative effort and the fragility of systems reliant on social organization. In the quiet placement of each stone, the empire achieved endurance, and in its decline, we see how even monumental achievements require continuous care and attention. In the quiet corridors of a medieval monastery, long before the hum of printing presses or the clatter of modern offices, a different kind of labor unfolded. Here, in rooms illuminated by flickering candlelight and filtered daylight, monks sat hunched over desks, copying manuscripts with meticulous care. The work was painstaking, repetitive, and often slow to the point of monotony. Yet these scribes played a crucial role in preserving the intellectual, religious, and cultural foundations of Europe for centuries to come. The monastic scriptorium, an austere room reserved for writing and copying, was the epicenter of this quiet labor. Each monk, trained in the art of calligraphy, worked in disciplined silence. Tools were simple but demanding: quills made from bird feathers, ink carefully prepared from soot or gall nuts, parchment or vellum painstakingly treated from animal hides. Every letter, every stroke was deliberate. A single mistake could ruin a page and force the monk to scrape the ink off the surface, a laborious correction known as palimpsest. The process demanded concentration, patience, and physical endurance. Hours were spent bending over a single page, the repetitive motion of hand and wrist echoing through the scriptorium in near silence. The subject matter of these manuscripts was diverse, but often rooted in religious, philosophical, or historical texts. Monks copied sacred texts like the Bible, commentaries by church fathers, liturgical works, and hagiographies. But many also preserved classical knowledge, texts by Aristotle, Cicero, Galen, and other thinkers whose works might have otherwise vanished during the political and social upheavals following the fall of the Roman Empire. In this repetitive labor, monks served as silent custodians of knowledge, creating countless hand-copied pages that would ensure the survival of ideas long after their own deaths. Life in the scriptorium followed strict rhythms. Work often began after morning prayers, a schedule that intertwined labor with spiritual discipline. The repetition of copying, writing, correcting, illuminating margins became almost meditative. Monks worked for hours in careful silence, interrupted only by brief periods for meals, further prayers, or essential stretching to relieve fatigue. Each manuscript might take months or even years to complete. The process was slow, exacting, and unglamorous, but it was essential for the transmission of knowledge across generations. Illumination, the addition of decorative elements like initials, borders, or miniature illustrations, added another layer of repetitive labor. While some monks specialized in plain text, others were trained as illuminators. These artists meticulously applied gold leaf, natural pigments, and intricate designs to the margins and initial letters of the text. Each stroke required precision and care, often magnified by the small size of the work. The effect, while beautiful, was also a testament to the patience and discipline of the laborers behind it. Every illuminated manuscript stands as a monument to slow, deliberate effort rather than spontaneous genius. The materials themselves demanded attention. Quills needed constant sharpening, ink required careful mixing to maintain consistency, and parchment could be temperamental, absorbing ink unevenly or developing imperfections. Monks learned to compensate for these challenges through repetition and observation. Each page was a lesson in subtle adjustments, pressure of the pen, angle of the quill, and flow of ink. Over time, a scribe's hand developed a rhythm that combined precision with endurance, creating work that could last for centuries if properly stored. Errors, though rare, were treated with both care and ritual. A mistake might require scraping the ink with a knife, smoothing the surface, and rewriting the text. This process could slow progress significantly, but was necessary to maintain the integrity of the manuscript. Monks took pride not only in completing texts but in doing so accurately, understanding that a single error could alter meaning or obscure knowledge. The act of repetitive correction became as important as the act of writing itself, a slow lesson in patience and humility. The social context of monastic manuscript production is equally revealing. Scriptoria were organized hierarchically, experienced scribes oversaw novices, providing instruction, corrections, and supervision. Tasks were divided according to skill and stamina. Some monks specialized in text, others in decoration, and others in preparing materials. Cooperation and coordination were essential, and yet much of the work was solitary, requiring extended periods of concentration and focus. The monastery functioned as both a spiritual and intellectual ecosystem, with the repetition of labor forming its quiet backbone. Despite its apparent monotony, this labor had profound implications. Each manuscript contributed to the preservation and dissemination of knowledge. In times of war, plague, or social upheaval, manuscripts copied in remote monasteries safeguarded texts that might have been lost forever. Through repetitive, painstaking effort, monks maintained cultural continuity, bridging centuries and geographies. The act of copying, though repetitive and slow, was foundational to the survival of ideas, influencing scholars, theologians, and eventually the broader world. Travel, communication, and trade within monastic networks also depended on these manuscripts. Copies were exchanged with other monasteries, lent to scholars, or sent to universities and churches. The repetition of labor extended beyond the individual scribe, forming a chain of human effort across time and space. Each page carried not only text but the imprint of disciplined hands, the echo of countless hours of observation, and the quiet perseverance of individuals who rarely left their cells but shaped intellectual history nonetheless. One subtle challenge in the scriptorium was the mental endurance required to maintain accuracy over long periods. Fatigue, monotony, and distraction could compromise the work. Monks developed techniques to sustain focus, rhythmic breathing, the repetition of prayers, and incremental progress checks. The physicality of writing, holding the quill, controlling ink flow, maintaining posture, combined with mental discipline to create an almost meditative state, where repetition itself became a tool for sustaining attention and precision. It is striking to consider that the knowledge we now take for granted, the philosophies of antiquity, the medical texts of early scholars, religious writings, survived in large part because of this slow, repetitive work. The scribes did not invent new knowledge, they safeguarded it. Each day, each page, each careful stroke reinforced the fragile continuity of human understanding. And yet, as essential as this labor was, it remained largely invisible to the wider world, overshadowed by the grand achievements of rulers, cathedrals, and armies. As this first section closes, we are left with a profound question. How did these monks perceive their own labor? Did they find spiritual fulfillment in the monotony, or did they struggle with the repetitive tedium of daily copying? And perhaps more intriguingly, how might history have changed if these laborious acts of preservation had not been performed with such consistent, uncelebrated diligence? As the centuries progressed, the scriptorium became a silent engine of cultural preservation, linking the intellectual heritage of antiquity to the medieval world. While the work appeared monotonous from the outside, within the walls of a monastery, it was both highly structured and socially significant. Every monk understood that the act of copying manuscripts was not merely clerical labor, it was a spiritual exercise, an intellectual responsibility, and a tangible contribution to the continuity of human knowledge. The process of manuscript production was painstakingly organized. Texts were first carefully read and sometimes annotated by a senior monk to identify passages requiring correction, clarification, or emphasis. The novice scribe might then produce a draft on scrap parchment, which served as a guide for the final, high-quality copy. This multi-stage process introduced deliberate repetition, ensuring accuracy through redundancy. Errors could propagate if not detected, so multiple eyes reviewed each section. The repetitive cycles of writing, reading, and correcting created a rhythm that defined life within the scriptorium. Materials dictated the pace of work. Parchment, crafted from carefully treated animal skins, was delicate and time-consuming to prepare. Sheets had to be smoothed, measured, and sometimes cut into uniform sizes. Ink preparation required knowledge and patience. Soot, gum, and water were combined, sometimes with additional ingredients for coloration. Quills had to be sharpened frequently and their nibs trimmed for precision. Each technical step was repetitive, yet essential, and mastery over these tasks determined the quality of the final manuscript. Small variations in pressure or ink consistency could affect legibility, permanence, or aesthetic appeal. Monks worked in disciplined silence, with only the occasional whisper or soft footstep breaking the quiet. The rhythm of repetition was reinforced by the liturgical calendar, which dictated periods of prayer, reflection, and work. Long hours were spent hunched over parchment, transferring entire texts by hand. Day after day, week after week, the same motions were performed. Letters carefully formed, lines evenly spaced, margins meticulously measured. The work demanded physical endurance as well as mental focus. Calluses, eye strain, and repetitive motion injuries were constant companions. Yet paradoxically, the monotony itself cultivated a meditative state, allowing the monk to sustain attention and accuracy across countless pages. Illumination, an art requiring additional specialization, added layers of repetition and meticulous care. Gold leaf was applied millimeter by millimeter, pigments ground and mixed by hand, and intricate designs painstakingly painted into margins. While the aesthetic effect might have seemed luxurious, the labor was repetitive and often grueling. Illuminators developed a rhythm, a disciplined sequence of strokes, washes, and layering, each step contingent on the last. Mistakes could ruin an entire page, requiring scraping and reapplication. The repetition was both physical and mental, demanding endurance, patience, and unwavering attention to detail. Beyond the physical and technical demands, manuscript production was also deeply social. Scriptoria were organized hierarchically, with experienced scribes instructing novices. Knowledge, techniques, and corrections were passed down through careful observation and mentoring. Collaboration was necessary when large texts were being copied. One monk might prepare parchment, another might copy the text, a third might correct errors, and a fourth illuminate the manuscript. Even in this collaborative environment, much of the work was solitary, requiring monks to maintain focus and rhythm in isolation for long stretches. Economic and political pressures also shaped monastic labor. Manuscripts were valuable commodities, often commissioned by wealthy patrons or religious institutions. The quality, speed, and accuracy of a scribe's work directly affected the reputation of the monastery. Mistakes could lead to criticism, delay in delivery, or financial consequences. The pressure to maintain consistency over hundreds of repetitive pages added an undercurrent of tension to the labor, blending spiritual discipline with practical responsibility. The intellectual dimension of manuscript production cannot be overstated. By copying classical texts, medical treatises, legal codes, and theological works, monks preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost to decay, war, or political collapse. Their work bridged centuries, allowing ideas from ancient Greece and Rome to re-emerge during the Renaissance. Yet this intellectual contribution was inseparable from the physical repetition of labor. Without the patient, meticulous copying of thousands of pages, knowledge could not survive. Repetition, in this sense, was not mere drudgery, it was a vehicle for the transmission of civilization. Challenges abounded. Natural light was limited, candles provided illumination but posed fire hazards and cast uneven shadows. Ink could smudge or run, parchment could warp, and errors could compound silently until detected. Fatigue and monotony threatened attention and accuracy. Monks developed strategies to cope: short breaks, rotations in task assignments, and self-imposed rituals to maintain concentration. Their work was an ongoing exercise in human endurance, combining precision, repetition, and adaptability to ensure that manuscripts met exacting standards. Travel and exchange of manuscripts expanded the impact of scriptorium labor. Copies were sent to other monasteries, cathedrals, and centers of learning, creating networks of knowledge that spanned hundreds of miles. The repetition of copying, performed by numerous monks over decades, produced multiple redundant copies, safeguarding against loss or destruction. The labor of one generation became a foundation for the next, creating continuity through cumulative, repetitive effort. Each monk contributed to a quiet, invisible chain that linked the past to the future. Yet even as the work continued, questions persisted about the human experience of this labor. Did monks find spiritual solace in repetition, or did monotony weigh heavily on their minds?
Travel and exchange of manuscripts expanded the impact of scriptorium labor. Copies were sent to other monasteries, cathedrals, and centers of learning, creating networks of knowledge that spanned hundreds of miles. The repetition of copying, performed by numerous monks over decades, produced multiple redundant copies, safeguarding against loss or destruction. The labor of one generation became a foundation for the next, creating continuity through cumulative, repetitive effort. Each monk contributed to a quiet, invisible chain that linked the past to the future. Yet even as the work continued, questions persisted about the human experience of this labor. Did monks find spiritual solace in repetition, or did monotony weigh heavily on their minds? How did they perceive the cumulative impact of their work, knowing that their efforts might take decades to influence others? The answers remain largely unrecorded, but the enduring survival of manuscripts testifies to their diligence, patience, and commitment to a slow, repetitive labor that shaped intellectual history. As this section draws to a close, one is left contemplating the paradox of monastic labor. It was repetitive, painstaking, and often invisible, yet it preserved knowledge, influenced culture, and shaped the intellectual future of Europe. The next section will explore the culmination of these efforts, the challenges of technological change, and the lasting legacy of the monks' quiet endurance. By the late Middle Ages, the scriptorium had reached both its peak and its turning point. The cumulative labor of generations of monks had preserved countless texts, classical philosophy, medical treatises, theological works, and historical chronicles, ensuring the continuity of knowledge that might otherwise have vanished during centuries of upheaval. Yet this period also saw the first signs of a profound shift, the invention of the movable type printing press in the mid-15th century. The relentless, repetitive work of copying manuscripts by hand was about to be transformed. The monks, unaware of the technological revolution looming over the horizon, continued their labor with the same meticulous rhythm. Pages were carefully aligned, ink prepared, and illuminations added with precise care. Their days remained structured by the chant of prayers, the measure of time and labor, and the repetition of skill honed over decades. Yet there was an undercurrent of change. Demand for books was increasing. Literacy was slowly spreading beyond clerical walls, and secular institutions were beginning to commission copies for practical, rather than purely spiritual purposes. The scriptorium had already evolved into a hybrid of spiritual discipline and economic activity, and this new era would challenge both its methods and its relevance. Despite the growing pressures, the work remained profoundly human. Each monk continued to lift quill to parchment, stroke by stroke, preserving knowledge with unwavering patience. Errors were corrected, pages meticulously illuminated, and texts carefully bound. The labor was repetitive, yes, but it was also a form of quiet mastery. In these small, repetitive acts, monks maintained not only the accuracy of information, but also the tactile aesthetic qualities of the manuscript, which would never be entirely replicable by machines. The personal imprint of a scribe, the subtle curves of a letter, the weight of ink, the care in spacing carried a human presence into every book, a dimension of history that printing could not initially replicate. The social and intellectual impact of this labor became more visible as copies of manuscripts circulated across Europe. Monks' work reached other monasteries, universities, and royal courts, creating networks of knowledge that were painstakingly maintained through repeated copying. Without their labor, many classical texts that later inspired Renaissance thinkers might have been lost forever. Each page, painstakingly copied, was a bridge across centuries, carrying ideas, knowledge, and cultural continuity through time. The repetition of labor, day after day, page after page, was the engine that enabled this extraordinary preservation. The challenges facing the scribes were also both physical and existential. Parchment was expensive and labor-intensive to produce. Inks could fail, and centuries of repetition could not prevent accidents. Smudges, torn pages, or water damage could compromise months of work. Beyond material concerns, the monks faced the challenge of intellectual responsibility. They were the custodians of texts, charged with preserving meaning accurately. A miscopied letter, a misaligned phrase, or a missed accent could alter interpretation, sometimes with significant theological, philosophical, or scientific consequences. This awareness imbued their repetitive labor with gravity and a subtle tension. Yet, in the face of these pressures, the monks persevered. The act of repetition, writing, correcting, illuminating, became both a spiritual and practical discipline. Labor was measured not in speed but in precision and endurance. The scriptorium was a space where human patience and concentration were cultivated and refined over decades. In this the monks achieved a remarkable feat. They transformed the mundane act of copying into a method of preserving civilization itself. Their labor may have appeared monotonous, yet it ensured that knowledge survived political upheaval, wars, and societal change. The arrival of the printing press did not immediately render the scribe's work obsolete. Manuscripts remained valuable for their artistry, rarity, and prestige. Illumination, careful binding, and unique annotations continued to distinguish hand-copied texts from mass-produced printed books. In a way, the repetitive labor of the scribe laid the groundwork for the dissemination of knowledge by mechanical means. The careful preservation of texts ensured that printers had accurate sources to reproduce. The centuries of patient repetition amplified the reach of human intellect, bridging the gap between ancient traditions and modern information networks. Today, surviving manuscripts offer a tangible connection to the labor of these monks. When you open a medieval codex, you encounter the cumulative effect of countless hours of repetitive work. The precise letters, the hand-applied pigments, and the carefully ruled lines. Each manuscript embodies the discipline, endurance, and quiet perseverance of its creator. The work of copying, repetitive and often invisible to the broader world, created a foundation for intellectual history, ensuring that texts could survive environmental decay, social upheaval, and the passage of time. The story of monastic scribes also highlights a broader lesson. Civilization relies as much on quiet, repetitive labor as on monumental events or dramatic figures. It is often the unglamorous, disciplined effort of ordinary individuals that preserves culture, maintains infrastructure, or sustains societies. While history tends to celebrate rulers, conquerors, and innovators, the monks remind us that patience, repetition, and meticulous attention to detail have an enduring, transformative power. As we reflect on their labor, one lingering question remains: how many other forms of repetitive human effort, often unnoticed in the present, are quietly shaping the future? The monk's work reminds us that preservation, continuity, and the slow accumulation of human knowledge depend on ordinary people performing repetitive, disciplined tasks. Their hands, their attention, and their patience were the hidden scaffolding of civilization. The manuscripts they produced endure not only as texts, but as evidence of human resilience, precision, and devotion. In the quiet repetition of their labor, the monks left a legacy that spans centuries, influencing thought, learning, and culture far beyond the walls of their monasteries. Their story demonstrates that even the most monotonous work, when performed with care and consistency, can ripple through history, shaping the world in ways that are profound, yet often invisible. The labor of medieval monks shows that repetition is not merely a mundane act. It is a mechanism for preserving civilization, knowledge, and culture. In their quiet persistence, they provide a model for understanding the invisible forces that sustain human society, and remind us that enduring impact often comes from patient, unglamorous work. Imagine standing on a rocky promontory, the wind whipping salt spray across your face, waves crashing endlessly against jagged cliffs below. There, perched at the edge of human habitation and the relentless expanse of the sea, stands a lighthouse. In the 18th century, these beacons were lifelines for sailors navigating treacherous waters. Yet the light does not shine itself. The responsibility falls on the lighthouse keeper, whose life is defined by monotony, routine, and the ceaseless maintenance of a single, vital purpose: to ensure that the lamp never goes out. Lighthouse keeping was an occupation defined by repetition, exactitude, and endurance. Keepers lived in isolated towers, often with small families or assistants, and their days revolved around the management of light, oil, and mechanisms. Maintaining the lamp required constant attention. Whale oil or colza oil fueled the flame, and the wick needed trimming to maintain a steady burn. Glass lenses and reflectors required careful polishing to ensure maximum luminosity. Even a minor lapse could mean the difference between life and death for sailors navigating in darkness or fog. Every day, these small, repetitive tasks were performed meticulously, forming the rhythm of the keeper's life. The isolation of the lighthouse magnified the tedium. In many cases, keepers were hundreds of miles from towns or villages. Supply deliveries were infrequent, and weather could prevent travel for days or weeks. Meals were simple, often consisting of salted meats, bread, and whatever provisions could be stored safely. The monotony of isolation was compounded by the unchanging scenery, a horizon of grey water, rocky cliffs, and turbulent skies. For the lighthouse keeper, time was measured not in social events or festivals, but in the steady rotation of duties, trimming wicks, replenishing oil, cleaning lenses, and inspecting the structure for damage. Beyond maintenance of the lamp, keepers were responsible for structural upkeep. Towers were battered by storms, their masonry weakened by wind and salt. Wooden floors swelled and warped with moisture, and iron fittings rusted under constant exposure. Maintenance involved repetitive physical labor, scrubbing floors, tightening fittings, repairing masonry, and replacing worn components. Even the seemingly trivial task of cleaning soot from chimneys or polishing brass fittings was essential to the safety and efficiency of the lighthouse. Each day, these chores repeated in a cycle, a rhythm dictated by both necessity and the relentless environment. The danger inherent in lighthouse keeping cannot be overstated. In addition to isolation, keepers faced storms that threatened both their homes and their lives. Waves could flood lower floors, winds could batter windows and doors, and snow or ice could make paths impassable. Keepers had to remain vigilant, performing tasks in conditions that would deter most workers. Yet their labor, repetitive and unglamorous, prevented countless maritime tragedies. Each polished lens, each steady flame, each repaired stone directly contributed to the survival of sailors hundreds of miles away. The social life of keepers was also minimal. Long periods without visitors fostered solitude, sometimes leading to boredom, introspection, or the development of small rituals to pass time. Families often adapted by establishing routines. Children helped with minor chores, pets provided companionship, and reading or letter writing occupied the quiet hours. Yet the central focus remained on the light itself. Even as the mind wandered during the long hours of isolation, the repetitive nature of work anchored the keeper's life, providing purpose amid desolate surroundings. Weather dictated much of the keeper's schedule. Storms required constant monitoring, and fog demanded vigilance to ensure that bells, horns, or other signaling devices were operational. Oil lamps needed constant replenishment, and lenses required additional polishing to penetrate dense mist. Every day, rain or shine, the keeper performed the same essential tasks. The repetition, far from dulling their attention, became a survival mechanism, ensuring that no error threatened the safety of passing ships. Technological limitations of the era amplified the demands on keepers. Before the widespread adoption of Fresnel lenses in the early 19th century, lamps provided limited light, making maintenance more frequent and precise. Wicks needed daily trimming, soot buildup had to be constantly cleaned, and reflectors were delicate and easily misaligned. Even a momentary lapse could reduce the light's visibility by miles, endangering ships in unfamiliar or dangerous waters. The repetitive precision of these tasks was not mere routine, it was life-saving labor executed under environmental and mechanical constraints. Yet, there were small rhythms and quiet rewards in the monotony. The steady turning of a lantern, the familiar pattern of a storm approaching from the horizon, or the successful navigation of a ship guided safely by the light, offered subtle, ongoing validation. Keepers developed intimate knowledge of the sea, wind, and weather patterns. Their lives, though repetitive and isolated, were deeply connected to the natural world. The monotony of labor was intertwined with acute observation, requiring patience, attention, and endurance. The labor of lighthouse keeping also had a broader societal significance. Merchants, fishermen, and naval vessels all relied on these beacons. The repetitive, unglamorous work of keepers created a safety network across perilous coastlines.
Unlike grand political acts or battles, the keeper's labor was invisible to most, yet it preserved countless lives, safeguarded trade, and maintained maritime stability. In essence, their repetitive work formed the quiet scaffolding of commerce and navigation.
As this section concludes, one is left with a reflection on human resilience. The life of a lighthouse keeper demonstrates how monotonous, repetitive labor can carry immense responsibility. It prompts us to wonder, how did these individuals endure years of isolation and repetition, performing the same essential tasks day after day, with no audience or recognition? And yet, their unwavering attention ensured the survival of countless sailors and the smooth functioning of trade routes across treacherous seas. The life of an 18th century lighthouse keeper was defined not only by isolation, but also by a relentless adherence to routine. The keeper's day began before sunrise and ended long after dusk, structured around the care of the lamp, the maintenance of the tower, and the observation of the surrounding waters. While modern observers might imagine moments of quiet contemplation, the reality was that the repetitive tasks required constant vigilance and physical stamina. Even minor lapses, a flicker in the flame, a layer of soot left uncleaned, could compromise the light's visibility, potentially leading to shipwrecks. The quiet repetition of labor, day after day, was therefore a moral as well as practical obligation. In addition to managing the lamp, keepers were responsible for signaling systems during fog, storms, or nighttime navigation. Bells, cannons, and other auditory signals had to be maintained with the same care as the light itself. Striking the bell at regular intervals during dense fog was not a simple mechanical task. It demanded endurance, timing, and physical exertion, particularly when storms made conditions hazardous. This constant attention to repetitive detail extended beyond the lamp and reinforced the centrality of labor to maritime safety. The keeper's life was a study in sustained, focused repetition, often performed under extreme environmental stress. Isolation also imposed psychological challenges. Many lighthouses were located far from towns or neighboring stations, sometimes separated by miles of treacherous coastline. For keepers and their families, social interaction was limited to occasional supply visits, letters, or rare travelers. Loneliness, boredom, and monotony were constant companions. Some keepers developed personal routines, small rituals, or hobbies to structure the long hours. Journals, sketches, or simple games provided mental relief, yet the primary focus remained on repetitive labor work that required discipline and attention to detail, regardless of the monotony or emotional toll. Supply logistics created additional layers of repetition and vigilance. Oil, food, and other essentials had to be rationed carefully, particularly during winter or extended storms when deliveries might be delayed for weeks. Keepers meticulously tracked inventories, ensuring that lamps could burn uninterrupted through long nights and severe weather. Even seemingly trivial tasks, such as cleaning containers, inspecting storage barrels, or preparing wicks, became crucial. The monotony of these actions concealed their significance. Each step in the chain of preparation was essential to sustaining the light and, by extension, maritime safety. Maintenance extended to the physical structure of the lighthouse as well. Salt water, wind, and rain constantly eroded masonry and metal fixtures. Floors warped, stairs weakened, and windows required regular sealing. Keepers repaired these damages repeatedly, often using simple tools in challenging conditions. Tasks like scrubbing soot from chimneys, polishing brass fittings, or replacing broken stones were not glamorous, yet they were essential for the tower's functionality. Each repetitive action reinforced the integrity of the structure, ensuring that it could continue to withstand storms and endure over decades of continuous use. The work demanded not only physical labor, but also acute observational skills. Keepers monitored tides, winds, cloud formations, and the movement of ships along the horizon. This daily practice developed an intimate knowledge of the coastal environment, a form of expertise that required continuous attention and repetition. Over years, keepers became experts in weather prediction, maritime hazards, and navigation, relying on patterns discerned through patient, repetitive observation.
In many ways, the monotony of their daily labor was intertwined with the development of specialized knowledge that could save lives. Social dynamics within the lighthouse could also affect labor. While some keepers worked alone, others shared duties with assistants or family members. Coordinating shifts, distributing tasks, and maintaining discipline in such isolated conditions demanded organizational skill. Miscommunication or lapses in diligence could be costly, making teamwork, even in repetitive routines, a vital part of operational success. The life of a keeper thus combined solitary endurance with collaborative coordination, each reinforcing the other and sustaining the lighthouse's essential function. The significance of the work extended far beyond the tower itself. Maritime trade, fishing, and naval operations all depended on reliable navigation aids. Every polished lens, trimmed wick, or repaired bell contributed to the safety of sailors and the efficiency of commerce. In this sense, repetitive, unglamorous labor had consequences that rippled across communities, regions, and even nations. The quiet persistence of lighthouse keepers was integral to economic stability and human survival along treacherous coastlines. Despite technological limitations of the era, keepers continually refined their practices. Lamps were adjusted for optimal brightness, lenses cleaned at precise intervals, and signaling systems tested regularly. Repetition was not merely rote, it was iterative and adaptive. Keepers learned from experience, adjusting techniques to improve efficiency and effectiveness. The monotony of daily labor coexisted with the subtle intellectual exercise of problem-solving, observation, and planning, small refinements that cumulatively enhanced safety over time. As storms lashed against the tower and darkness fell over the sea, the keeper's labor remained steady and unbroken. The physicality, precision, and rhythm of repetitive work were not only a practical necessity, but also a psychological anchor. In the quiet repetition of daily tasks, keepers found stability amid environmental unpredictability. Their labor was slow, monotonous, and often invisible, yet it was essential for preserving life, enabling trade, and maintaining the delicate balance between human endeavor and the relentless forces of nature. By the close of this section, the interplay between repetition, endurance, and survival is evident. The work of lighthouse keepers demonstrates how monotonous tasks can carry immense responsibility and impact, and yet the lingering question arises: how did keepers psychologically endure years of isolation, repetition, and the constant pressure of life or death responsibility? The answer lies in the next chapter of their story, the long-term consequences of their labor, its culmination, and the legacy left for generations of sailors and coastal communities. As decades passed, the life of the 18th century lighthouse keeper remained largely defined by repetitive, disciplined labor, yet the cumulative impact of their work became increasingly apparent, both in the survival of sailors and the stability of maritime trade. Ships navigated treacherous coastlines, fishermen returned safely from offshore, and goods continued to flow along trade routes, all made possible by the quiet, unglamorous labor performed day after day, year after year. The keeper's flame was not merely a physical light, it was a symbol of endurance, vigilance, and the power of repeated human effort.
The legacy of these laborers was reinforced by technological evolution. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, innovations such as the Argand lamp, parabolic reflectors, and later Fresnel lenses transformed lighthouses. These developments increased the intensity, range, and efficiency of light, but they also required careful adaptation by keepers. The work remained repetitive and exacting. Lenses had to be polished, mechanisms maintained, and lamps trimmed, yet the stakes and precision of their labor became even more exacting. Their deep familiarity with the rhythm of maintenance allowed them to operate these new technologies effectively, ensuring continuity amid change. Isolation remained a constant, shaping both the human and operational dimensions of lighthouse keeping. Keepers developed coping strategies, meticulous routines, detailed logs, and personal rituals provided structure and focus. Some kept extensive journals, recording weather, ship movements, and maintenance schedules.
Others engaged in quiet hobbies, reading, sketching, or crafting to pass the long hours. Yet the core of daily life remained repetition: the trimming of wicks, polishing of lenses, inspection of mechanisms, and careful monitoring of the surrounding sea. In their monotony, these acts became a form of meditation and a tangible assertion of control over an unpredictable environment. The broader social and economic impact of lighthouse labor cannot be understated. Merchants relied on predictable navigation. Naval operations depended on strategic signaling. The repetitive labor of keepers ensured these systems functioned without interruption. Every polished lens, well-maintained bell, and constant observation contributed to a web of safety and commerce stretching across coasts and oceans. Unlike dramatic historical events, battles, treaties, or royal decrees, the significance of a keeper's daily work was measured in lives preserved, ships saved, and trade routes stabilized, a quiet but profound influence on society. Challenges persisted. Storms could isolate keepers for weeks, supplies could run low, and equipment failures demanded urgent repair under extreme conditions. Yet these challenges reinforced the necessity of repetition and diligence. The repeated cycles of inspection, cleaning, and repair created a resilient system. Minor errors were caught before they became catastrophes, and continuity of labor ensured that even in adverse conditions, the lighthouse fulfilled its purpose. The labor itself became a bulwark against environmental and human unpredictability. Families of lighthouse keepers, often living within the tower or nearby cottages, adapted to the repetitive rhythm as well. Children participated in minor chores, learning the value of precision and routine, while spouses often managed provisions and assisted with maintenance. Life was insular, yet intensely focused. Every member of the household contributed to the ongoing repetition of labor necessary for survival and safety. In this way, the work extended beyond the individual keeper, encompassing the family as a collective unit of endurance and responsibility. Over time, the psychological endurance of keepers became as critical as their technical skills. Monotony, isolation, and exposure to danger tested human patience and resilience. Yet repetition, structured routine, and clear purpose enabled keepers to endure. The daily rituals, lighting lamps, polishing lenses, striking bells, became stabilizing anchors, creating continuity in an unpredictable natural environment. In essence, the repetitive labor cultivated not only functional skill, but also psychological fortitude, a quiet testament to human adaptability. By the 19th century, lighthouses had become more standardized, and technological innovations reduced some of the manual burdens. Yet even then, the human element remained indispensable. The labor of keepers, centuries of repetitive attention to detail, ensured that these innovations could function effectively. The flame they tended, the lens they polished, and the signals they maintained created an infrastructure that extended far beyond the individual tower. Their work left a legacy of safety, reliability, and human perseverance embedded in maritime culture.
The life of an 18th century lighthouse keeper offers a striking lesson. Monumental impacts can arise from repetitive, disciplined, and often invisible labour. It was neither glamorous nor widely celebrated, yet it shaped societies, preserved lives, and facilitated trade across continents. The monotony of daily tasks, when combined with precision, vigilance, and endurance, created outcomes of immense consequence. Their work reminds us that history is not only written in dramatic events, but also in the persistent, careful labour of ordinary people performing repetitive acts over long periods. As this section concludes, one can reflect on the enduring resonance of the keeper's labour, how countless hours of repetition, performed without recognition or reward, created systems that safeguarded human life and enabled civilization to function smoothly. And yet, the question remains, in an era increasingly driven by speed, automation, and instant results, how often do we overlook the quiet, repetitive work that underpins our safety, knowledge, and daily lives? The lighthouses of the 18th century serve as enduring reminders that the slow, persistent work of human hands often shapes history more profoundly than we realise. The repetitive, disciplined labour of lighthouse keepers demonstrates that even monotonous tasks can have life-saving, civilization-sustaining impact. Their work offers a timeless lesson in patience, endurance, and the hidden scaffolding of human society.
In the quiet heart of a medieval village, where narrow dirt roads wound between thatched cottages and smoke curled from low chimneys, the mill stood as a subtle but essential hub of daily life. Unlike knights, nobles, or bustling merchants, the miller's work was largely unseen, repetitive, and often overlooked. Yet for villagers and peasants, the miller's labour shaped survival, nutrition, and social rhythms. Flour, the product of the miller's meticulous work, was a lifeline bread, the most basic staple, dependent entirely on their skill. The medieval mill was a place of constant motion, though outwardly it might seem still. Watermills and windmills transformed natural forces into mechanical energy, grinding grain into flour. The miller's work began before sunrise and extended long after dusk. Grain arrived from nearby farms, and the first task of the day was sorting, measuring, and weighing the kernels. Every sack was carefully examined for quality stones. Husks and impurities had to be removed. Even the smallest miscalculation could result in poor flour, spoiled bread, or wasted grain. The repetition of sorting, pouring, and inspecting was both monotonous and crucial. Watermills, depending on the flow of rivers or streams, introduced additional layers of labour. The miller had to monitor the watermill constantly, adjusting sluices, removing debris, and ensuring that the wheel turned steadily. A single blockage could halt production, threatening the food supply for the village. The sound of grinding was a constant presence, a low, rhythmic drone, punctuated by the occasional creak of wooden gears. Millers became attuned to this sound, able to detect a minor misalignment or excess wear from subtle shifts in tone. Years of repetition honed their ears as much as their hands. Windmills, in contrast, demanded a more physical engagement. The miller climbed ladders, adjusted sails, and managed wooden gears, all while contending with gusting winds. The repetitive motion of turning the cap, trimming sails, and monitoring grinding stones required both endurance and precision. Each adjustment was calculated to maintain consistent grinding speed too fast, and the flour burned too slow, and the output lagged. The repetitive nature of these tasks forged an intimate relationship between human labour, natural forces, and mechanical rhythm. Inside the mill, the environment was simultaneously dusty, noisy, and oddly intimate. Flour dust hung in the air, settling on wooden beams and stone floors. The grinding stones, rough and heavy, required continuous attention. The miller measured the fineness of flour, adjusted stone spacing, and ensured the millstones rotated smoothly. Every stroke of the hand, every glance at the mechanism, repeated dozens of times throughout the day. The work demanded patience and attention to detail, qualities that defined the miller's quiet expertise. The miller's labour extended beyond the mill house itself. Grain had to be transported from fields, sacks carried across muddy roads, flour delivered to villagers or local bakers. This involved repeated lifting, balancing, and careful handling to prevent spillage. Repetition dominated both technical skill and physical endurance. The same motions, performed endlessly, day after day, formed the foundation of sustenance for the entire community. Socially, the miller occupied a curious position. Villagers depended on their labour, yet often viewed the miller with suspicion or mild distrust, for the miller controlled the grain supply and levied tolls in exchange for milling services. Despite their essential role, millers were sometimes accused of cheating or overcharging. This delicate social balance required subtle negotiation, careful bookkeeping, and adherence to repetitive practices of measurement and standardization. The miller's work was as much about maintaining trust as it was about grinding grain. The medieval diet itself made the miller's work critical. Bread, formed the bulk of daily meals, and the quality of flour directly affected health, nutrition, and survival. Coarse flour, fine flour, bran, every variety requires different grinding techniques. The miller repeated these tasks with precision, aware that errors could mean hard, bitter bread or uneven cooking. Repetition was not mere tedium, it was the mechanism through which sustenance was reliably produced, ensuring the village survived winters, shortages, and poor harvests. Beyond the technical and social dimensions, the miller's labour also carried subtle rhythms of observation and skill. Millers developed a keen sense of grain quality, adjusting grinding speed, stud spacing, and even humidity levels to achieve optimal flour. Each day, the same motions were performed, yet small variations demanded attention and judgment. Repetition was interwoven with judgment, a pattern of labour and observation honed over years, quietly transmitting expertise across time. Even leisure, when it existed, was framed by the repetition of daily labour. Many millers lived adjacent to their mills, ensuring constant monitoring. Meals were simple and repetitive, often consisting of bread, porridge, or stew products of the very labour they maintained. Children, apprentices, or assistants participated in the routine, learning through repetition the intricacies of milling. The mill became both home and workplace, a space where the cycles of labour and life intertwined seamlessly. The miller's influence extended subtly beyond immediate survival. A well-maintained mill ensured the village could store flour for months, buffer against poor harvests, and support local economies. The repetitive labour of sorting, grinding, and measuring enabled a fragile balance. Communities could survive scarcity, trade flour with neighbouring villages, or maintain reserves in times of crisis. This quiet work, largely invisible to chroniclers or nobles, shaped the rhythms of daily life and the resilience of medieval society. As this first section closes, one begins to understand the paradox of the miller's life. Monotonous, repetitive, and often underappreciated, yet utterly indispensable. Each grain measured, every stone adjusted, and each sack carried was part of a chain of labour that ensured survival, trust, and social stability. And yet, one lingering question remains. How did millers maintain focus, precision, and patience across long days filled with such repetitive, dusty, and noisy labour? The next section will explore the personal rhythms, challenges, and quiet ingenuity of millers that allowed them to endure and perfect their craft over decades. The miller's life was a constant negotiation between repetition and subtle adaptability. While much of the work involved routine, sorting, grinding, lifting sacks, adjusting millstones, the variations in grain, weather, and mechanical wear demanded careful attention and ongoing problem solving. No 2 days were entirely identical, yet the tasks themselves remained fundamentally repetitive, structured by the cycles of nature and the needs of the village. In this repetition, the miller found both mastery and endurance. Grain quality, for example, dictated the miller's approach each day. Wheat, rye, barley, and oats each required slightly different stone spacing and grinding speeds. Moisture content varied seasonally, requiring adjustments to prevent clumping or excessive dust. The miller's keen observation skills, developed through countless repetitions, allowed minor tweaks to prevent spoilage and maximize yield. Over time, this repetitive work became instinctive. A subtle change in stone vibration, a shift in smell, or a slight variation in flour texture prompted immediate correction, almost without conscious thought. Watermill introduced another layer of complexity. The flow of the river, influenced by rain, drought, or seasonal shifts, affected grinding speed and efficiency. The miller adjusted sluices to control water pressure, sometimes opening or closing gates multiple times per day. Debris twigs, leaves, or sediment could jam the wheel or wear down the gears, requiring repeated inspection and removal. Maintaining a constant grind became a balancing act of vigilance and repetitive labour, with the miller attuned to the subtle sounds, movements, and rhythms of the mechanism. Windmill, less common but equally demanding, required continuous physical engagement. The miller adjusted sails to harness changing winds, often climbing ladders to make minute corrections, while gusts threatened both the structure and the worker's balance. Each adjustment repeated the same motion, tightening ropes, trimming sails, checking gear alignment. The repetition was physically taxing, yet the miller developed a rhythm synchronized with natural forces. In this synchronization, repetitive labor became a form of subtle mastery, blending human endurance with environmental observation. Inside the mill house, dust and noise formed a constant backdrop. Floor dust coated wooden beams, floorboards, and every surface, while the low drone and grinding stones echoed endlessly. Despite these discomforts, the miller maintained careful attention to every detail. Hands became calloused from lifting and pouring sacks, eyes adjusted to the dim, flowy light filtering through small windows, and ears tuned to the consistent hum of the machinery. The repetition of these environmental challenges became a kind of tacit training, reinforcing focus, patience, and precision. Beyond technical skill, the miller navigated the social demands of the village. Measuring grain accurately, delivering the correct amount of flour, and maintaining fairness in toll collection are essential for trust. Disputes could arise if a miller miscalculated or was perceived as negligent. This repeated act of weighing, recording, and delivering flour reinforced social bonds as much as it ensured food security. Here repetition functioned both as a practical necessity and as a social stabilizer. The village depended on consistent, predictable labor. Apprenticeship added another layer of repetition. Young learners spent hours observing and imitating the miller's movements, from lifting sacks to adjusting stone spacing. Mistakes were corrected through repeated demonstration and practice. Over months and years, repetition instilled muscle memory, judgment, and understanding of subtle mechanical cues. The cycle of teaching and performing the same tasks again and again preserved the knowledge of milling across generations, embedding expertise in human habit rather than written instruction. Even moments of rest were framed by repetition. Meals often coincided with pauses in milling, simple and repetitive themselves. Bread, porridge, and broth, sometimes flavored with whatever vegetables or herbs were on hand. These breaks punctuated the rhythm of labor, reinforcing the cycles of activity, observation, and care. In this way, repetition extended from work into life, creating a structured, predictable existence amid the uncertainties of medieval agriculture. The miller also developed small innovations within this repetitive framework, like adjusting stone grooves, modifying grain funnels, or reinforcing wood supports required experimentation, repeated over weeks or months. Each adjustment was tested, refined, and repeated, often yielding minor improvements that cumulatively enhanced efficiency, flour quality, and durability of the mill. Repetition, in this sense, was both labor and learning, a slow, iterative process that combined manual skill with observation and judgment. Seasonal rhythms intensified the repetitive nature of the work. Harvest brought long days of continuous grinding as grain poured in from fields and neighbors queued to have their crops milled. Winter, with frozen streams or calm winds, demanded careful management of stored grain and mechanical upkeep. Every season introduced repetitive challenges, yet the miller's work remained the constant heartbeat of the village's survival. Each cycle reinforced expertise, endurance, and resilience. In essence, the miller's life illustrates a profound truth about repetitive labor. Monotony does not imply meaninglessness. The repeated cycles of sorting, grinding, lifting, adjusting, and observing created stability, ensured survival, and transmitted knowledge. Every motion, performed countless times, contributed to a larger system sustaining the village's food supply, economic structure, and social trust. Repetition became the medium through which expertise, reliability, and resilience were forged. As this section concludes, one begins to sense the quiet ingenuity embedded in repetitive labour. Millers were not merely workers performing rote tasks, they were observers and innovators and custodians of survival. Their skill emerged through patient iteration, attentive repetition, and continuous adaptation to the mechanical, environmental, and social challenges of their world. And yet, one question lingers. How did millers endure the physical toll, mental strain, and constant vigilance required for decades of repetitive labour without succumbing to fatigue or error? The next section will explore the culmination of their work, the long-term legacy of milling, and the lessons embedded in this quiet, uncelebrated craft. The life of a medieval miller, built on years of repetitive labour, was one of quiet but profound consequence. Over decades, the miller became an essential linchpin in the village's survival. Each sack of grain sorted, each adjustment of millstones, each careful measurement of flour reinforced the reliability, food supply, economic stability, and social cohesion. While their labour was largely invisible to chroniclers and nobles, the cumulative effect of their diligence shaped the rhythm of daily life and the resilience of medieval communities. Miller's work had a tangible impact on sustenance and health. Bread was the staple of medieval diets, and the quality of flour determined not only taste but nutrition. Coarse bran or unevenly ground wheat could result in dense, unpalatable loaves, while precise milling produced consistent flour capable of supporting a balanced diet. Each day's repetitive labour, performed with patience and care, ensured that villagers had reliable access to this fundamental sustenance. Without this consistency, communities would have faced famine or malnutrition, particularly during harsh winters or fall harvests. Beyond food production, millers influenced trade and local economies. Flour could be stored for months, allowing villagers to buffer against scarcity, and surplus could be exchanged with neighbouring communities. Accurate measurement, careful handling, and consistent quality tasks repeated endlessly enabled trust and commerce. In this way, millers' work underpinned not only survival, but also the economic stability of the region. Their repetitive labour formed a hidden network that sustained villages and reinforced interdependence across medieval society. The miller's craft also left an enduring legacy of knowledge. Apprentices learned through observation and repetition, internalizing techniques, problem-solving skills, and observation acuity. Each iteration of millers built upon the previous one's accumulated wisdom, adjusting stones, refining water wheel mechanics, and improving efficiency. Repetition develops a conduit of expertise, ensuring that the subtle art of milling, knowledge that could not be fully captured in writing, was transmitted across decades. In this way, the monotony of labour became a vehicle for innovation, adaptation, and cultural continuity. The physical and mental demands of labor were relentless, dusty, noisy, and repetitive. The work required endurance and focus, long hours, exposure to fluctuating temperatures, and the constant vigilance needed to monitor machines and grain tested the limits of stamina. Yet repetition itself provided structure and stability. In performing the same tasks day after day, millers cultivated patience, resilience, and the ability to anticipate problems before they arose. The labour was both demanding and meditative, a rhythm that balanced monotony with acute awareness of the work's consequences. Socially, millers maintained an uneasy yet essential possession in the village. Their repetitive measurement and oversight were the foundation of trust between themselves and the villagers. Errors could provoke disputes, but consistent, careful labour reinforced reliability and confidence. By performing these monotonous tasks accurately, the miller ensured a smooth functioning of community life, demonstrating how ordinary labour, repeated diligently, can uphold societal cohesion. Even when technological innovations gradually emerged, improved millstones, better water wheels, and eventually mechanized milling, human labor remained indispensable. The miller's experience, judgment, and repetitive practice enabled these innovations to function safely and effectively. The centuries of careful repetition prepared millers to integrate new methods without compromising quality, illustrating the enduring importance of skill honed through repetitive work. The aesthetic of the mill itself reflected this repetition. Worn wooden floors, polished by countless footsteps, grooves of millstones curated by centuries of grinding dust-coated beams marking the passage of time, each element bore witness to repetitive labor. These physical traces, subtle and unremarkable at first glance, were monuments to endurance, precision, and human effort. They remind us that history is often preserved not in grand events, but in the consistent, diligent actions of ordinary individuals. Reflecting on the miller's life highlights a profound historical truth. Quiet, repetitive labor forms the hidden scaffolding of civilization. While kings, battles, and monumental achievements dominate chronicles, the survival and stability of everyday communities depended on diligent, patient work performed day after day. The miller's skill ensured sustenance, transmitting knowledge, and maintained trust, demonstrating that repetition, far from trivial, can carry extraordinary consequences across generations. In the end, the medieval miller's legacy is both tangible and symbolic. Flour of bread in the smooth operation of a village economy, where the immediate outcomes of the deeper lesson lies in the power of endurance, precision, and repetition. The miller reminds us that slow, persistent, and largely invisible labor often shapes the world more profoundly than dramatic events or celebrated figures. Every grain measured, every stone adjusted, every cycle of grinding was a quiet act of continuity, resilience, and life-sustaining care. The hidden life of medieval millers illustrates that even the most repetitive, dusty, unseen work can wield enormous influence over survival, society, and culture. Through patience, vigilance, and enduring repetition, ordinary laborers shaped history in ways that remain essential yet often unnoticed. In a narrow cobblestone alley of a medieval town, behind a heavy wooden door, lay the apothecary's shop, a place of quiet diligence, earthy aromas, and slow, deliberate labor. Unlike knights on horseback or merchants in bustling markets, the apothecary's work was neither dramatic nor widely celebrated. Yet for villagers and townspeople, this small room filled with jars, powders, and dried herbs was a lifeline. The health of families, the recovery of workers, and even survival in times of plague depended on the apothecary's patient, repetitive tasks. The day began with careful preparation. Shelves of jars, each labelled in faded ink, contained dried roots, crushed minerals, powdered bark, and dried flowers. Apothecaries measured to precise quantities of ingredients, often weighing them simple balance scales or grinding them with a mortar and pestle. Repetition governed every step, crushing, sifting, weighing, and combining substances to create remedies for ailments ranging from minor fevers to chronic pain. Each motion, repeated hundreds of times, required concentration and dexterity. Even a small miscalculation could render a potion ineffective or dangerous. The apothecary's tools reflected the meticulous nature of their craft. Mortars and pestles, once smooth from repeated use, were paired with sieves, glass jars, and metal spoons. Every surface bore the marks of countless repetitions. Scratches on the counter, stains of past preparations, and faint cracks in ceramic bowls. The tactile experience of labor, feeling the coarseness of a root, the grade of a powdered mineral, the weight of a balanced scale, formed the core of the apothecary's expertise. Over years, this repetitive interaction with materials built an intimate knowledge that could not be entirely conveyed in written recipes. Ordering and cataloguing herbs and minerals required a similar rhythm of care. Dried plants were sourced from local markets or distant trade networks.
then stored in wood boxes or glass jars. The apothecary meticulously checked each shipment for freshness, purity, and authenticity, repeating the process with each new arrival. Every day, the act of organizing, inspecting, and labeling created an internal map of the shop, ensuring that remedies could be assembled quickly and accurately when needed. The repetition of cataloguing is invisible to patrons but essential to the function of the shop. Clients arrived throughout the day with illnesses, minor injuries, or preventative concerns. The apothecary greeted each visitor with quiet attention, listening to symptoms, consulting written recipes, and preparing compounds tailored to the individual. Each preparation required repeated movements, measuring powders, combining liquids, stirring, heating over small lamps, and bottling. The precision demanded that repetition ensured both efficacy and safety. In a world without modern medical oversight, the apothecary's careful labor served as a safeguard against error, protecting the vulnerable from harm. Apothecaries also engaged in experimentation, though within the repetitive cycles of preparation, adjusting proportions, testing combinations of herbs, or refining drying techniques required repeated trials over days or weeks. Incremental refinements applied through repetition gradually improved potency, solubility, or shelf life. This slow, iterative process mirrored the rhythm of daily labor, blending repetition with observation, patience, and careful judgment. This way, even mundane chores, cleaning counters, polishing jars, sweeping floors, followed the same principle. Repetition maintained hygiene, order, and operational efficiency. The structure provided by these tasks allowed the apothecary to focus on more complex work without distraction, demonstrating how the simplest repeated motions could uphold both function and safety in the shop.
As this first section closes, one begins to appreciate the quiet significance of repetitive labor in medieval medicine. Apothecaries were not heroic figures in the conventional sense, yet their patient, meticulous, and repeated work shaped survival, well-being, and trust in communities. And yet, a lingering question remains. How did apothecaries sustain concentration, accuracy, and patience over decades of labor while navigating the constant pressures of illness, scarcity, and the weight of human dependence? The next section will delve into their ingenuity, endurance, and subtle adaptations that allowed this essential craft to endure. The apothecary's work was defined by repetition, yet within this rhythm lay subtle ingenuity and adaptive skill. Each day, the same motions, grinding roots, sifting powders, weighing minerals, were repeated dozens, even hundreds of times. To the untrained eye, this might appear monotonous or mechanical. But the quantity, each repetition reinforced mastery, judgment, and observation. Minor adjustments to texture, moisture, or proportion could determine whether a remedy soothed a fever, eased pain, or failed entirely. Over years, repetitive labor became a form of quiet expertise, embedding practical knowledge in the hands and senses. Apothecaries were constantly adapting to the variability of their materials. Herbs arrived with differing moisture content, colors, and potency, depending on the season, storage, or source. Minerals could be coarser or finer than anticipated, requiring adjustments in grinding or mixing. Every variation demanded a precise, repeated response. More grinding here, less sifting there, or slight recalibration of scales. This cycle of repetition and adaptation created a rhythm of problem-solving that was slow, meticulous, and deeply embodied. The apothecary's body and senses became instruments of continuous quality control. Fire and heat were another constant consideration. Many remedies required slow heating over oil lamps or small hearths. Maintaining steady temperatures demanded repetitive attention. Stirring, adjusting flame height, testing consistency, and monitoring for early signs of burning or curdling. These tasks were physically taxing and mentally exacting, yet repetition allowed the apothecary to predict outcomes, respond quickly, and maintain efficacy.
Each day reinforced an intimate understanding of the interaction between material, temperature, and time, a knowledge born entirely of repeated practice. Record keeping was equally repetitive and vital. Apothecaries maintained logs of recipes, dosages, and outcomes. Each entry required careful transcription, often with faded ink on fragile parchment. The repetition of recording, checking, and cross-referencing ensured consistency across patients and remedies. These records were not merely bureaucratic, they preserved subtle patterns of observation, documenting which combinations were most effective, which herbs lost potency in storage, and which remedies required adjustment for seasonal ailments. Through repetition, knowledge accumulated slowly but reliably. Social interactions also relied on repeated patterns of behavior. Patients expected measured doses, precise preparations, and calm reassurance. Apothecaries greeted each visitor with attention, carefully listening to symptoms, observing signs, and selecting the appropriate remedy. The repeated performance of these social rituals reinforced trust and authority. The same gestures, explanations, and careful handling were enacted daily, creating a sense of reliability and stability. In this way, repetition was a social as well as practical tool, reinforcing the apothecary's indispensable role in the community. Apprenticeship continued the cycle of repetitive learning. Young helpers performed the simplest, most repeated tasks first, sifting powders, counting pills, cleaning jars. Over months and years, these repeated actions honed dexterity, observation, and memory. Mistakes were corrected by demonstration and repetition, embedding expertise physically as much as cognitively.
By the time apprentices were entrusted with more complex preparations, their hands and eyes had internalized the rhythms of the work, allowing precision to emerge naturally from repeated practice. The repetitive labor also shaped psychological endurance. The apothecary's work was dusty, fragrant, and sometimes noxious. Hours were spent in dimly lit rooms, eyes straining to observe minute differences in texture or color. Mental fatigue threatened accuracy, yet the rhythm of repetition became a stabilizing force. Each motion, each measure, each combination acted as a cognitive anchor. Over years, these repeated routines fostered patience, resilience, and a meditative focus that enabled long hours of uninterrupted attention. Innovation often emerged within repetition. Apothecaries experimented with techniques, tools, and combinations, but these experiments were grounded in routine. A new grinding method, a modified sieve, or an adjusted dosage required repeated trials to evaluate its effect. Repetition allowed subtle improvements to accumulate slowly, yielding better efficacy, faster preparation, or more reliable storage. This incremental refinement demonstrates how repetitive labor can coexist with creativity and problem solving, producing results that are both precise and adaptive. The apothecary's environment reinforced the importance of repetition. Shelves lined with jars, mortar and pestle worn smooth from centuries of use, scales calibrated daily, all reflected the continuous, cyclical nature of the work. Even cleaning and maintenance followed repetitive schedules. Dusting jars, wiping counters, and sweeping floors ensured that the shop remained functional and hygienic. These repeated, seemingly minor tasks supported the broader, more complex labor of preparing remedies, illustrating the interdependence of routine and skill. By the close of this section, it is clear that repetition in the apothecary's life was both practical and transformative. It ensured accuracy, maintained hygiene, preserved knowledge, and fostered social trust. Yet despite centuries of repetition, the work remained demanding and nuanced, requiring constant attention, judgment, and subtle adaptation. The question that lingers then is, how did apothecaries sustain their precision, patience, and authority over a lifetime of such repetitive labor, often under the shadow of disease, scarcity, and community reliance? The next section will explore the culmination of their craft, the long-term impact on community health, and the enduring legacy of their meticulous, repetitive labor. The life of a medieval apothecary, defined by decades of repetitive labor, was one of subtle but profound influence. Each day, The painstaking work of grinding, weighing, and mixing compounded into a form of quiet mastery. Every carefully measured herb, every sifted powder, and every bottled remedy contributed to the survival and well-being of villagers. While the apothecary rarely appeared in chronicles or noble records, their labour shaped the rhythm of everyday life and the resilience of the community in ways that were tangible, enduring, and often invisible. The apothecary's influence extended beyond individual remedies. By consistently preparing accurate and effective medicines, they reinforced communal trust in healthcare. Families relied on them not only for treatment but also for advice, reassurance, and guidance during epidemics or chronic illness. Repetition ensured consistency. Each patient could expect the same careful measurements, the same methodical preparation, and the same attentiveness. This predictability was crucial in a world where miscalculations could have fatal consequences. In essence, repetitive labour became a form of social reliability, safeguarding both life and trust. The cumulative effect of repeated work also fostered knowledge preservation and innovation. Apprentices trained under the watchful eye of the apothecary learned through constant repetition, mixing, grinding, sifting, and observing minute differences in texture, smell, or colour. Over years, these apprentices internalized the subtleties of the craft, carrying forward expertise that could not be captured entirely in texts. Innovations, subtle adjustments to preparation methods, new herbal combinations, or improved storage techniques were developed incrementally through repeated practice and observation. Repetition became a conduit for learning, adaptation, and the slow evolution of medical knowledge. Apothecaries also mitigated scarcity and uncertainty. Medicines were prepared in advance, stored carefully, and rationed when necessary. Repetitive preparation allowed for accurate stockpiling, reducing waste and ensuring that remedies were available when needed most. In periods of epidemic, the apothecary's systematic, repeated work provided stability amid panic and illness. Every measured dose, every bottled remedy reflected an ongoing commitment to precision and endurance. The repetitive nature of labour, often dull and dusty, became the backbone of community resilience. The physical environment mirrored this repetition. Shelves lined with uniform jars, counters polished and worn smooth by decades of grinding, and mortar and pestle scarred from centuries of use testified to the continuity of labour. Even minor cleaning and maintenance routines, dusting, wiping, sweeping, were performed with consistent care, ensuring that the environment itself supported meticulous work. Repetition reinforced reliability, precision, and the quiet dignity of craft, transforming mundane gestures into pillars of survival. Over a lifetime, apothecaries developed both technical skill and psychological endurance. Long hours in dimly lit, fragrant, and dusty rooms demanded patience and focus. Repetition provided rhythm and stability, turning labour into almost meditative practice. Each motion, grinding, measuring, combining, acted as a stabilizing anchor, enabling apothecaries to maintain precision despite fatigue, distraction, or stress. Their expertise, honed over decades, emerged from these cycles of repetitive practice and careful observation. The social and historical significance of apothecaries becomes evident when considering the broader context. Communities without reliable apothecaries faced higher mortality, slower recovery from illness, and disrupted labour cycles. In contrast, villages with diligent, repetitive care benefited from improved health, social trust, and continuity of knowledge. While unremarkable in appearance, the apothecary's labour ensured that society functioned smoothly, illustrating that ordinary, repetitive work can yield extraordinary long-term consequences. In conclusion, the medieval apothecary exemplifies the profound impact of patient, repetitive labour. While their days were filled with